Okay, welcome to this panel on science fiction as tragedy. I said this last time I did this, but it's even more true this time. My fellow panelists really don't need introduction. John Clute, Samuel Delany, our guest of honor, Gardner Dozois.
Oh shit, is that who I am?
Yeah. And Barry Morton.
No wonder I don't make any money.
What, you thought of Barry Malzberg instead?
Yeah, I've been hoping.
Our panel description says Gardner Dozois' 1992 collection Geodesic Dreams has an epigraph from James Tiptree Jr. Man is an animal whose dreams come true and kill him. In Dozois and Tiptree's fiction, protagonists fail and often die because of something inherent in their biological or social makeup. CF, love is the plan, and plan is death, or a kingdom by the sea. Where classical ideas of tragedy often involve unwise choices, the characters in Tiptree-esque tragic SF ultimately have no choices at all. What other works of speculative fiction do this? How does science fiction setting accommodate this expansion of the tragic argument? And what makes these bleak stories so appealing? If they are. Do you read A Kingdom by the Sea to cheer yourself up? I don't know.
Yeah. Especially when I want to kill a cow, and I go out in the backyard and I hit one with a sledgehammer.
You have a big hammer in
and a whole bunch of cows, and I keep them in the basement.
But I suppose the first question that sort of springs from that description for me is, are there other instances of science fiction with the same sort of explicitly, directly tragic sort of thrust that the Tiptree stories or whatever have?
Well, we have several eminent critics here, so we probably let them start. I'm just an editor myself.
No such thing as just an editor.
Simple village editor.
I sit under the spreading chestnut tree all day.
The remains of which still remain. Okay, okay, one other obvious kind of science fiction or scientific romance genre, subgenre of story in which typically there was a tragic frame and a tragic outcome, whether it was the early Superman story. J.D. Beresford's Hamptonshire Wonder, Olaf Stapleton's Odd John, and a lot of minor novels of the same sort usually ended in a overarching personality and intensity of being that did not match with the world and was consequently either destroyed or self-destroyed. And how close is this to the classic model of tragedy, I would leave it to others to determine, but it feels intuitively to me as though the Superman story had something to do with Homer's, had something to do with the original model of tragedy. Another one is Philip Wiley's Gladiator. There's a large number of them. It took someone like A.E. Van Vogt made out in Canada with no sense of tragedy, just as it were, surviving the wilderness and writing stories of high imagination that got him out of there. Before A.E. Van Vogt, I think that was the dominant form of tragedy.
People are still cupping their ears. Should we travel one of these?
Am I not loud enough?
I think John's mic in particular.
John seems to be
Audible or not audible?
Okay, right.
Okay, I'm moving the next word here.
Yours
John.
just have to point where you want. You just have to point it correctly.
if you swallow entirely, that will.
How's
that?
Right. Please,
Okay.
please
Was
do this if you're having
was there any
a
part of that absolutely irreplaceable paragraphs that did actually get very hard to hear? I mentioned three figures: J.D. Beresford's Hamptonshire Wonder, Olaf Stapleton's Odd John, and Philip Wiley's
Gladiator.
What are they called?
Gladiator.
Gladiators. There, what's his other name? And aligned all this to the story of Hubris, the story of the inevitable fall over against the natural world.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because you bring to mind the fact that there are kind of two
Theodore Sturgeon thing. It's the new step in evolution, and it's just waiting to show that the survival of the fittest will make it triumph over everything. And then there's the one where because it's different, it's not going. It has to be stamped out. It's not going to win. It's not going to be dominant.
Or it's going to lead to despair.
And it will lead to despair and unhappiness in the person or the subject who is different is going to be unhappy because they're different, and they're going to have a bad time. Two other just examples of science fiction stories with unhappy endings, which I think is basically what we're talking about here, in one sense. I'm reminded of George Steiner's comment on tragedy: the best of them are sad. Is Joanna Russ's We Who Were About To, which is not only a story that has an unhappy or sad ending. It's constantly ups the ante. Each section of the story ups the ante. It's going to be a story where you pretty well quickly figure out, well, at the end of the story, everybody is going to be dead. But at the middle of the story, everybody is dead, except one person. And you think, but we've got half a book to go. There's only one, and she's killed everybody off. What happens now? And the tour de force aspect of the book is that every time she gets to a spot that traditionally, in traditional narrative, would be a hard spot to carry on from, the novel gets more and more exciting. So the second half of the novel I find much more exciting than the first half of the novel. And indeed, as she gets closer and closer to starving herself to death, what becomes the foreground of the story is the various fantasies that she starts having, and they get wilder and wilder. And so by this technique, she ends up making a novel that gets more and more exciting as it goes through, even though there is less and less traditional novelistic material to deal with until finally it is time to die, literally.
Well, as I said on another panel last year, this is not the panel for which I signed up. I thought that this was going to be a panel on science fiction as tragedy. And that rather than sharing plots of stories with unhappy endings, we were going to talk about the very formulation of a genre which I think most of you in the room would know, I feel is essentially tragic. And whose tragedy is built into its very nature. And that we talk about that, or Harlan Ellison would show up, maybe, and he would say, this is the most ridiculous summation I've ever seen. Tell me a tragic science fiction story, each of you. A tragic science fiction person or story. That would be interesting. Talking about stories with unhappy endings doesn't interest me. I've written my share by the hundreds for it. But what there is about this genre, which I think makes it essentially tragic, that would be interesting to discuss. Gardner, you've read more unpublished science fiction than anybody in this room, and that includes me, and I'm close, but you got to read. Do you think that, how much do you think tragedy is intrinsic to the genre of science fiction? Well, I like to say that I've read more bad science fiction than anyone else alive. On the other hand, I've also read more good science fiction than anyone else alive. And I've been being forced to take on the role of cockeyed optimist here, but I don't really think that the field is in all that bad a shape. I think it's in bad shape. I'm talking about its root formulation. That there is something about science. Well, I'm not sure that's true of science fiction, just. I think it's true of literature in general. There's no such thing as a happy ending. A happy ending is an artificial construct.
It's only a happy ending if you control where you stop observing your characters. I mean, there's a happy couple, they've gotten together, they've fallen in love, you know, but if you look at those characters 20 years down the line, you know, she's died of liver cancer and he's in a little rundown cold water flat somewhere toasting Spam over a Bunsen burner. So, everybody, there's no such thing as an ultimately happy ending. If you follow the characters below the beyond the snippet where they're happy, they're going to sooner or later end up unhappy because everybody dies. The Earth will die eventually. The galaxy will die. Even the universe probably will die. So it all depends on where you stop and freeze the frame and say, well, they're happy now. You know, then he's not going to get cancer, you know, 2 years from now. So it's an artificial construct. There is no happy ending.
No one expected this to be the feel-good hour. I think
mildly what might say that to describe a certain kind of scientific romance as possibly inherently akin to the tragedy is not talking about unhappy endings. And the other thing I would like mildly to say is that your argument is, I find, deeply sympathetic, but deeply arrived from the conventional wisdom about American SF and its plot, in which there were marriages, there were endings which stopped soon enough so that they were happy endings. And there was a premise that science fiction, insofar as it was story-like, did, as it were, move towards the tendency or obey the tendency of stories to seem to end now.
Well, I can remember a time, as I'm sure Barry can, where editors would actually reject your story because it had an unhappy or downbeat ending. I mean, I used to get that quite a lot.
I hope I'm remembering accurately, but someone, maybe Lavi Tita, said online last week that he had got a rejection letter as recently as this month from a prominent hard science fiction monthly periodical, which I'm not going to name.
Does the name start with an A?
It starts with Anne. And it said essentially, our readers don't like stories where the protagonist can't find a way out. You know, and so it may not solely be a past tense issue, but is it not the case that tragedy is rather more than just unhappy endings? Is it not?
Exactly.
Well, as it were, inherently unhappy endings?
That's a very good point. I think traditionally I see science fiction characterized critically as optimistic more times than I see it characterized as tragic. And that's because for many years the basic model for the science fiction story is that a problem, you get a problem and you solve the problem, and by the end the problem is solved and everybody shakes hands and smiles and says, wow, we solved the problem. So that as the story represents a passage of experience snipped out of life, the particular passage snipped out of life ends with people smiling, as it were, rather than looking dour. The problem is, of course, is that when you do actually solve problems, often there's a big price for solving the problem. And people who have a sense of what the price is for solving problems tend to see the world in more tragic terms. I once wrote a novel in which I forgot literally that there had to be a price for the problem solved, a book called Nova. And when I first finished it, everybody was running around happily at the end and smiling. And a friend of mine read it and said, that's silly, you've got all the stuff and you've just used it to light a match. Doesn't anybody have to pay for this? And I realized, my friend was right. And so basically, the main character has to lose all his senses and is going to wind up a psychopath because he can't. That's a little bit more realistic. the genre wasn't set up to remind everybody, especially if you were a young writer, and I was a fairly young writer when I was writing this, and it took somebody with a little bit more experience of life than I had to remind me, hey guy, you can't, it costs more than that, to save the universe.
I would along agree with Barry, in a sense, although I would shift the focus of the science fiction story as being essentially tragic back to England, and back to, say, Brian Aldiss, whose famous quote on the subject is, one definition of science fiction for him was humorous battered by nemesis. And his description was based, of course, on English experience, and on his argument that the first science fiction novel, of course, was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which cannot be argued to have a happy ending, and that most science fiction for the next 100 years or so can be arguably seen in terms of a series of stories of how various forms of improved being, improved life, transcendence turn out not to be fit the world, the changing, terrible world that they saw the scientific romance writers in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and that the American science fiction triumph was an engineering triumph, and a lot entailed from the triumph of engineering. Engineering, if you don't think about side effects, is a tool through which you can engender happy endings. That's maybe the root definition of engineer's mind, happy endings.
Well, Aldous also said that a story was always improved by a bit of bracing gloom and despair.
That was his defense of the John Campbell Memorial Award, which my Beyond Apollo got.
Yes.
That in the face of all that criticism, it had a decent sense of human tragedy.
Yeah.
Amazingly, this did not end the discussion. It did not compose a summary conclusion. In fact, it just raised the stakes. Well, you only want tragic work. You want to destroy science fiction. You're looking for a novel that will blow up everything in which Campbell believed. I would say, and again, Gardner, I solicit your opinion, if we can look at the whole Campbell Memorial Award controversy, fortunately unknown to this audience, we could say that there were two sides, and this is the ship sailed on. All this lost. If really, wouldn't you think that again? And looking at from 1973 on, if Beyond Apollo, if calling Beyond Apollo the best novel of the year was Aldous' attempt, however misguided, to stake a position, then he was run over by an express train.
Well, I have sort of mixed feelings about this. As an editor, I had a reputation for buying gloomy, depressing stories, and there were people that complained that I had brought all these gloomy, depressing stories into Asimov's. So I do like a good bracing shot of gloom every once in a while. But I think that sometimes gloom goes too far for most of the general readership. I mean, I've been reading a lot of these global warming eco-catastrophe stories for the last 10 years or so. And the story starts out where everything is hopeless, and the person lives in a hopeless universe, and things get worse, and then they die. And a lot of people will say at that point, well, what's the point of reading this story then? And so I can sort of see both sides of the pessimistic, optimistic thing. I think you have to walk a fine line between the two in order to get through to people.
But, I mean, going back to both to what you said and to what Barry said earlier, I've always read Barry's body of work as, I suppose, embodying the kind of tragic sensibility that I read this panel description as being about. That you're saying that a number of the enterprises that science fiction has traditionally believed in, space travel, an American century that might, make sense and bring some good to people. All of these are inherently flawed, and they're just going to lead to tears of doom. And with climate change, to steal a word from John, it may be simply that climate change is not very easily storyable, that it happens over such a long span, any fixes would have to happen over such a long span, that it's actually very difficult to compose either a story or a novel that fix the shape you expect.
One interesting thing I've noticed, which I think is a little odd, is that often post-apocalyptic stories where our civilization has been destroyed completely are oddly hopeful. I mean, there are some odd little streaks of upbeat, maybe it was a good thing that our civilization was destroyed. And that I find strange. I mean, civilization is destroyed, everything is over, but, hey, maybe this time we'll get it right,
It might be an idea to return for a second to James Tiptree Jr. because it is, I think, arguably the case that for Europe as a whole is remarkably different, remarkably downbeat in a certain sense in terms of its outcomes, but at the same time, it's through her devotion to science fiction as a form, while at the same time writing within constraints of passion and her own life history that did not enable her to write every kind of story she might have wished. James Tiptree Jr. was able to use science fiction to generate stories with tragic endings that at the same time had a deep gaiety. And the notion that a story with an unhappy or a tragic ending are the same story is, I think, probably false. I think a story with a tragic ending is a tragedy, and a tragedy can be suffused with the joy of the world that is going to be lost, and the fact that she could write that in science fiction and write as with loyalty, genuine science fiction stories that did not violate, as far as I can tell, a single law, rule, convention, except, of course, deep inside they were tragedies, is a kind of mark of the capacity of the form to encompass successfully a huge, huge range of material.
Well, of course, in The Women Men Don't See, the women escape and go to a better place.
That's probably why that story is the most popular story.
That is frequently a motif in science fiction. Things may suck now, but down the line, somehow we will go to a better place, we will make it better, we will create a better society. Well,
okay, so two women, one of them pregnant, are going to create a better human society somewhere else. How?
They create a better society for them.
That's suicide.
They create a better society for themselves.
How?
No, they can create a better life for themselves.
No,
they're not concerned with, what happens to the rest of us.
They get in a Dodge City, but you don't see it.
No. Now, you want a really depressing Tiptree story, try On the Last Afternoon.
Yes.
Where these alien creatures, sort of like mating turtles, are surging up out of the ocean, and there's a human colony frailly hanging on to existence, and they're going to crush them out of existence, not even through malice, but just because they're in the way. And the protagonist meets a different kind of alien who says to them, basically, well, all of you people are going to get killed, but I can make you immortal, and you can go in a different form to the stars and live forever. And the protagonist turns this down and stays with his people and gets crushed to death anyway, and they all die. And he's even turned down the chance of transcendence that the other alien offered him. So that's like really bleak.
Try slow music.
Slow music, yeah.
That's a cheer up.
Yeah.
I thought that the Bester story, they don't make life like they used to. I thought that was the most depressing goddamn story I had ever read. And then she comes along 15 years later and she does what is in effect a vicious parody of it. And it makes the best of story look cheerful. that is, as I've said this a while, if you look at science fiction in a certain way, slow music along with Born with the Dead may be the greatest science fiction story ever done. But wow. But the fact that you can make a serious argument that those two, and I take I and Gomorrah on, which I've praised on panels with you, I put I and Gomorrah in that place. If you can make a serious case, as I could, that these are the 3 best science fiction stories ever published, then this is one hell of a category. Because they most fully realize those 3 stories. The capacity of science fiction to see and do what no other kind of literature can. As you wrote in your afterword, the gap between the disparate and the desperate and the human, that's really what science fiction can do, which nothing else can do nearly as well. And that intrinsic capacity is what makes this such a desperate proposal.
And given that those stories are, from the 1970s at the latest, would you see it as a retreat from, would you see science fiction as having retreated from that peak since then?
Well, what about Alfred Bester's Adam and No Eve? Is that a pessimistic story or an optimistic story? It takes place after a presumed nuclear holocaust. Everybody else on Earth is dead. There's this one guy who is crawling hideously through the burning sand for the entire length of the story. And at the end, he falls into the ocean and dies. But the salient, this was in the 50s, by the way. The 40s. You're right. The salient point there is that by falling into the ocean while he dies, the bacteria in his body are going to get into the ocean and start the ecosphere all over again. So it's like, is that upbeat? Yay, ecosphere all over again. Or like, last guy on Earth crawling and falling into the ocean and dying. I mean, it's hard to say whether that's pessimistic or optimistic.
I might add to this litany, it doesn't feel like a litany when we remember the story, is Theodore Sturgeon's The Man Who Lost the Sea, which, to my mind, is a story which obviously we know from the get-go that the story is going to end in his death in the moment, the second before his death. But what we don't realize is that Sturgeon is going to, with this extraordinary complex compassion, I think one might put it, synopsize the entire story of science fiction up to that date. The last line is, I think, he made it on Mars at the point when some of the more recipient science fiction writers may have guessed that we weren't going to make it there, and that the story wasn't going to work just as his attempts to rewrite his life and survive wasn't going to work. It's astonishingly good story, and very precise, and he doesn't usually pack a great ending to the way I read stories, but that ending is one of the finest endings. Ending that possible.
Can I suggest another story which maybe sits with that also as a closing down of science fictional possibilities, which is John Crowley's great work of Time, which starts out from the premise that this well-intentioned, I think they're called the Otherhood, might be able to skew history through time travel in more humane, more liberal ways, even if it is through preserving the British Empire. And by the end of the story, both the wrongness of that premise and the wrongness of how they've tried to do it is so utterly, utterly clear.
What is the, what actually is the ending of Silverberg's dying inside? How does it?
Hello.
Yes.
Hello,
Yeah.
He's the man who lost the sea, but has gained the world.
Yeah.
He can, stripped of telepathy, stripped of his talent, stripped of all that which he felt justified his miserable life, he is able for the first time to reach out.
And he becomes, as I said, something like Robots.
He becomes ordinary. In becoming ordinary, he becomes transcendent.
Yeah, he becomes more like Silverberg than Silverberg was portraying himself as being like throughout that story.
Yeah.
Because only when he ends the story can he actually write it. He's capable of the complexity of the capacity.
I'm happy to go on with us people talking, but my sense is there are quite a few hands or potential hands in the audience. So
Almost everyone has a hand.
That's a tragedy.
your observational skill is remarkable. Yes, gentleman over there.
I was wondering about the pushing a little bit of the definition of the word tragedy. You know, if you think about the utility of tragedy, it's one thing. But I always think of the Shakespearean version of tragedy, or at least when he plays the second Macbeth, where the quote unhappy ending end quote is always confused, as John was saying, with a kind of wonder at the world. I mean, the ending of Dying Is Died reminds me a lot of the ending of Richard II, where the king loses everything and in losing everything discovers its humanity, or King Lear, where the same thing happens. I wonder if because I don't think a tragedy is unhappy ending. I think unhappy ending is depressing. But a tragedy is not depressing. A tragedy has an unhappy ending with, I'm going to use the term, a moral uplift that goes along with it. Is that what we see in these kinds of science fiction stories you're discussing?
I suppose, speaking just for myself, I agreed with you right up until you used the word moral. In that I would certainly think of, I don't know, works of music. I think of Mahler's Ninth Symphony as being a profoundly tragic work, but I find it very difficult to attach moral values to a piece of non-programmatic classical music. So, up to that point, I was sort of with you.
Well, there's also what you might call the Viking optimism, or Norse optimism, which it didn't matter if you died. It mattered that you tried. You know, the gods all knew that they were going to be defeated, they were all going to be killed at Ragnarok. And the idea was that in spite of that, they did the best they could anyway. And I think that's a thing that sneaks into science fiction here and there. There's a story of mine called Machines of Loving Grace that my friend George Martin loathes. And he says it was like the most depressing story he's ever read in his life. It's about this woman who keeps killing herself, and the big brotherish government, through technological means, brings her back to life again, and then she kills herself again. And George said, boy, this is really depressing. And I said, well, no, not really. If she gave up and stopped trying to kill herself, then it would be depressing.
Yes,
and that's Norse optimism for you.
Paul Anderson is often said to be a writer who wrote in a tragic vein, often like the Shakespearean tragedy, but as someone noted, the tragedy always, to Anderson, in almost every case, had a sense of tragic grandeur to it. And I always had a feeling that he's kind of pulling his punch. His characters may die, they may die nobly, doing the wrong thing, but they're granted a piece of tragic awareness at the end. A moment of self-awareness and a moment of perhaps redemption before he dies. Except for one story. It's very rarely for Anderson, it was a short story. It's called Journey's End.
Yeah.
Where there is no grandeur and no nobility. It ends on a squalid note of recognition that human beings actually, if they really could have a Sturgeon-like meeting of the mind, they would loathe each other and recoil. End of story. And it was, he seemed to sense that it was a story that was so contrary to what he usually did that it was rarely reprinted. He called it Journey's End and left an exclamation, left the apostrophe out of the first word, making it a declarative sentence. And every single editor who's ever done it, including Lasker and Nesco, has restored it. As though Anderson was signaling to us.
It was the early 50s.
Yes. Yeah, around there. But in sense of the sense that true tragedy is not noble, it's sordid. Was getting an almost unique iteration there. I don't think we're going to comment on that.
Well, as Tiptree said, man is the animal whose dreams come true and kill him. You know, if you could have a true meeting of the minds, it might well turn out that, you know, you loathe each other and there was no real reconciliation possible. Maybe we're better off not being able to really know each other.
That's true sight is something that's too painful to. Okay, this really is the feel good panel. Yes, Jim.
So also, to some extent, commenting on the self-referentiality that the previous questioner just kind of asked about. What's your perspective on books that share that duality of tragedy and hope, but in a skewed sense, like Matheson's I Am Legend, for example, that sort of inverts some of the things that we humans might hope for necessarily?
Well, I haven't read this in a long time, but as I recall, the kicker there is that the zombies are actually creating a better civilization, the one that they replaced with the humans. So again, that's sort of an ambiguous.
That's the appearance of it.
Yeah.
And it inverts the sense of who's the monster.
Yeah, yeah. It's
all the way through. You've been thinking
the human is really the monster.
Exactly.
I reviewed the Atrocity exhibition by Ballard in fantasy and science fiction like 35 years ago. USA title, Love and Napalm. And that's one bleak, terrible book without any hope. And I concluded the review by saying, yes to all of it, but this is beautifully written. This is magnificently constructed, brilliantly styled book. Nothing this beautifully written can be seen as despairing or pessimistic, or which is just a steal. I mean, there I am typing away and stealing from Lear's, not Lear, Kent. As long as we can say this is the worst, it is not yet the worst. And I find that Ballard novel is profoundly affirmative. So is Slow Music, so is I and Gomorrah. They are great works of art. They're Margot Ninth Symphony, the Beethoven Rosa Fugue. They are the Brahms German Requiem, which the Philharmonic played at its first concert after 9/11. Anything this beautifully done is inherently optimistic. It is an optimistic in the sense that it affirms life. Ballard had to be alive and to care enough to write the Atrocity exhibition and to believe in his deluded little heart, as I did in Beyond Apollo, that it is going to improve the world to put that into the world. And that is the difference between being depressed and being clinically depressed. We do our work, Henry James, and hope for the best in the madness of art.
If I may give a very, very brief excursion into probably illegitimate territory, really, but it's very clear that Ballard, in terms of his own life, was clawing himself back into the capacity to write and to survive after tragedy, as his wife died suddenly, various other things happened. And those stories represent not only what they represent, but they represent the capacity to use the artifact, the making of an artifact of art, as something which transcends, which claws against almost irrecoverably bad situation, tragedy, depression, or the world itself. And by the time he got way past that, he began to write much, much calmer, tamer, and less memorable books.
Exactly. That is as good a parsing of Ballard's career as you're ever going to get anywhere. That's precisely the point. As he began to privately or personally resolve, his work deteriorated. That is one painful statement, but I think it is indisputable.
And it's an argument I think you've made in a different form about Tiptree. That once her identity was...
Yeah, I mean, this panel wasn't going to be about the relationship between Sleight and the other panel, Tiptree. Once she lost or abandoned the self that was Tiptree, Alice Sheldon, I don't think, could continue to, as it were, create the artifact in the same way. And I think all the greatest stories were written, not necessarily published.
She created a persona with
Yeah,
Tiptree that enabled her to say things in ways that she couldn't say as herself. And once that persona had been diminished by being made public, she was never the same again.
This is all true, but John and I disagreed on this. All of that is true with Yankee Doodle, which you published. It's really damn good.
Yeah, it is.
It's really good in that it's at the top of her work, and it came years after her exposure.
I actually thought with Yankee Doodle that she was starting to work her way into better work again, because I hadn't much liked the stuff from the last couple of years before that, and then of course she died, so we'll never know. I was interested always in seeing what the mature work that Alice Sheldon would have written rather than James Tiptree Jr. And you get a little hint here and there that it might have been extraordinary.
Except, as Julie Phillips, her great biographer, Sheldon was convinced that she was nothing inside. That there was no persona that she could have. She needed to be something else. She needed masks. She needed a false voice because there was no real Alice Sheldon. Well, this was her life.
She certainly lived with despair. I mean, I myself have received phone calls from her where she told me that she was sitting there with her revolver in her mouth, and as soon as she was done talking to me, she was going to pull the trigger, and I had to try to talk her out of doing that, which is not a position an editor likes to be put in.
But she sure didn't do that. No. As long as we can say this is the worst, it is not yet the worst.
No, she didn't call me.
When she went ahead and did it, she didn't call me.
She didn't call me. I did not talk her out of it. So.
Okay, more questions?
Great, good one.
Yes.
To what extent would a writer's religion or ideology or some other sensibility contribute to the tragic aspect of that writer's work? There have been panels at Readercons before, for example, looking at what makes a Catholic science fiction story a Catholic story.
No fish on Friday.
Aside from that minor tragedy, what is there about, say, the Catholic sensibility or the feminist sensibility or whatever else you might want to
Well,
call
I'll
it?
let the eminent critic speak to that, but for my opinion, the big difference is if you are a devout Catholic, you believe in an afterlife, you believe in a reward in heaven, and so that means that it's worth it. You're going to get to the afterlife, you're going to get to heaven. It's going to be different than it is here, and that's almost optimistic in a strange way by.
I don't think it necessarily has to do with the content, the specific content of any religion or ideology, or that you believe in. I think if you think this either a religion or something like feminism or whatever focuses real important human problems, it allows you a frame in which to go more deeply into those problems in your work. And if it's reflected in the work, people, your readers, can respond to the depth and the intensity with which manifest itself in the work. And I think this is what happens in Joanna Russ's work. It is so much about feminism. It's more than, it's about being human and believing in making things better, which is the main way that feminism affects her fiction. And I think this is the way any ideology or any belief, at its best, works with a writer.
Well, having been really depressing here, I will say that one of the things that I find very positive about human beings is that when there's a disaster or an accident, people will instantly rush to help, and they will risk their own lives to help. I've seen this, myself, and that strikes me as inherently noble, regardless of how we act the rest of the time.
Yes, the crowds coming up 2nd Avenue on 9/11. I was there. I was a couple of miles from the impact. The crowds pouring north, and the shopkeepers coming out to offer them water, fruit, whatever. The immediate, the huge crowds gathered at blood donation sites within the first 24 hours was remarkable. We're not that bad. The trouble is that it takes a crisis to make us not that bad, and that's poor politics.
I sometimes think we're too hard on ourselves. We're not that bad,
but
what is better?
Yeah.
I mean, we're about as good as it gets. For all of our faults. Unless there really is a God and a hierarchy of angels, we're about as good as it gets.
I had a hand.
And is that a tragedy, or is that?
This goes back, I guess, to the Catholic side of things a little bit, but Ray Lafferty would say that, anyways, the science fiction situation is one where the world has ended, and that whether the story is the day after the world ended or whether it's the first day on a new planet is a function of what you do with it from that point. And is that something that rings true about the science fiction or tragedy mode, that it's something that it's how we cope with it from that point that starts in devastation and then we go from there?
That's one kind of science fiction. There are many others.
Well, this is where the hope and the apocalyptic stories come in, and it's we've really screwed up, and half the people in the world are dead, but we're going to do better the next time around.
And I think I can't think of any stories of an instance so far as tragedies are stories with any kind of sequel. Tragedies don't have sequels, and that's one of the, obviously, for the reader, the saving graces of the tragedy, that not only are you not lumbered with marketing imperatives, but you are actually able to attempt to understand the shape of something, and no sequels.
Okay, I think we are out of time.
They do have prequels, though.
But prequels are an appropriately tragic thought to end on. Thank you very much.